Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Dopo Francesco Saverio, Le lingue delle missioni indiane. That's the title of our last panel. Because the two speakers are presenting in English, let's change all the panel to English. Please have mercy with my English. I'm Swiss, my first language, foreign language is French. And now I teach here in Italian. So English is, I'm not used to speak English. But only to reflect now about Francis Xavier. Francis Xavier is one of the founding fathers. Not only this, Francis Xavier was the big attracting saint of the old society of Jesus. He was the great role model of a Jesuit and also of a missionary. Saint Francis Xavier left us an extensive collections of letters, but we have also many testimonials from other authors about him. It's not easy to get to the bottom of his true personality, because many writers already saw him as a saint. In any case, he was present in the catechesis of the local population. And so he got in touch with indigenous languages and intercultural communication in India, in the Moluccas, and in Japan. How successful he really was and what really motivated him is another question. This panel, however, is dedicated to encounters with indigenous languages in modern India after Francis Xavier. So we are studying now his heritage in its creativity. The first speaker is Paulo Aranya, a historian specialized in Catholic missions in India in the early modern times. He published a monograph about the Latin Christianity in India in the 16th century. And now he is continuing a research on the controversy of the Malabar rites, and he's preparing also a database of all the students of the Pontificio Collegio Urbano since its foundation of 1627. His conference title, Liquido et Adamussim, Pagan Baptismal Names and Translation Equivalents of Christian Concepts and Objects in the Malabar Rite Controversy. Please.
Thanks for the introduction, and actually I'm happy that the paper by the colleague Giulia Nardini already anticipated some of the context, the background of what I'm going to say, so I will be able to maybe move quicker. I would say that, in general, just as a reflection, the challenges of early modern global Catholicism are many, of course, but two we can certainly distinguish. How was it possible to make Roman Catholicism, defined by its Greco-Roman roots and European developments, understandable in non-European cultures? And of course, secondly, how could a Catholic faithful be sure of invoking the true God, his angels, the Blessed Virgin, the saints, and not something else totally unrelated in substance, but maybe similar in external appearance? All missionaries agreed on the need of adapting Catholicism in some way or another to other cultures. So I would say that there are no actually missionaries who said no adaptation at all. We struggle to find those. However, there were major disagreements on the extent and the forms in which such adaptation should take place. And in the Asian context, this issue was at the origin of the controversies on the Chinese rites and the Malabar rites. Just a word on geographic context. I'm going to talk about three specific areas in South India. So the adaptationist missions of Madurai, which is in the center, you can see, defined by yellow boundaries. Then Mysore, which is just on the left, so to the western side. And the one of the Carnatic, which is basically the area between southern Andhra Pradesh and the northern Tamil Nadu. So, just to be clear, this is not about Goa, it's not about Kerala. Malabar rites don't have to do with the Syro-Malabar rites. It's a maybe banal clarification, but it's important. Also, the colleague Nardini already mentioned Roberto Nobili, what he did, the kind of mission that he started in Madurai. I would like to stress just one point, maybe, of all that it was targeting in its intentions the upper caste, specifically the Brahmins in Madurai. Eventually, the mission was not Brahmanical in its outcome. It took a very different result eventually, but at the beginning, that was the ambition. And because of that, in order to achieve such conversions, Nobili thought that it was necessary to give up this European appearance of his and pretend, so to say, to be a religious specialist of the local culture and belonging to an upper caste. Caste is a word that I'm repeating here frequently, and it's not a neutral word. It's obviously very charged, but it is crucial to this whole discussion. Namely, this was not this adaptation of the missionary and of Christianity in these adaptationist missions in South India. It was not about a problem of cultures. It was truly a problem of social structures which, as they were not allowing otherwise the propagation of the faith, because converting meant, without adopting such adaptations, it meant the loss of caste, basically social degradation. We are moving straight towards the 18th century. So the missions developed throughout the 17th century, the Madurai mission at the beginning, the Mysore mission in the middle of the 17th century, the Carnatic mission basically at the beginning of the 18th. And the crucial moment, of course, is the expedition by this Piedmontese man, Carlo Tommaso Meillard de Tournon, who was sent to the east with the purpose of basically settling problems in China concerning quarrels among missionaries, not only Jesuits against the others, but also, I should say, between Jesuits, Portuguese and French, fighting one with each other, and also to enforce in China a forthcoming decision by the Holy Office, by the Roman Inquisition, on the Chinese rites. His stopover in India, in Pondicherry, namely on the coast of Coromandel in Tamil Nadu, was not actually planned, so to say. And also, it's not correct to say that he was sent to India to settle the Malabar rights controversy. Actually, we might say that he let this controversy, which was already brewing, explode. And in fact, during his stay, which was of 8 months and due primarily to health problems of his and the logistic issues, namely the need to find shipping to China via the Philippines, he undertook what we can call a secret investigation on the so-called Malabar rites, namely practices that were allowed by the Jesuit missionaries in that place, specifically French missionaries of the Carnatic mission, to the local Catholics, which were these rites. We are going to see now which rites. They were fundamentally practices that were deemed to be Hindu and tolerated and kept by the Catholic neophytes. Why they were keeping them, now we are going to see the logic why they kept. So it's not just attachment to customs, but there was something essential and important, which is precisely what I argue to be the problem of basically social reproduction, the reproduction of social structures, and the keeping of social distinctions and purity. So basically my argument is that the decree that Tournon, issued in the summer of 1704, basically tackled the number 17 different rituals without order. If you read the decree, you don't see the clear order, but actually if you analyze them anthropologically or indologically, it becomes quite clear that there was a logic, namely some of these rituals had to do primarily with the reproduction of caste and society. So just imagine baptism, marriages, and so on, certain rituals associated to birth and etc. All the sphere of human generation, so for instance, celebration of first menses of women and so on, and other rituals had to do primarily to the upkeeping of social distinctions between different castes within within the Christian fold. I'm going to talk about some specific, so to say, Malabar rites, which are related with the issue of translation and language. But before that, just give you an idea, vague idea of what these Malabar rites look like. So some, actually at least a couple of rites had to do with the tilakas, namely signs that were drawn with ashes or sandal on the forehead or other parts of the body. They had multiple meanings. Certainly they had, many of them, sectarian meanings, like for instance belonging to the Vaishnava or the Shaiva sects within what we today call Hinduism. But also others had more, so to say, a direct connotation of caste belonging. So the problem was precisely, are these tilakas all superstitious, namely religious, or are these ones social markers? If they are social, there shouldn't be a problem for Christians to keep them. But if they are pagan, obviously a Christian cannot. Now, getting to the three clauses of the decree which deal with language and translation and so on. So the one about baptismal names, which I so to say, classify as a reproduction of social structures, it's about the fact that the names for the newborns could not be anymore names of idols or of penitents of the false religion, meaning Hinduism. And on the contrary, there should be names of saints taken from the Roman martyrology. And so it was quite a strict, somehow, requirement. And then this other clause, the third, was concerning the names of sacred objects. So this basically said that the missionaries should not alter the names of the cross, of the saints, or of sacred things by translating them. Now the question is, what do we mean by translare? That's very important, because obviously this Latin verb can imply multiple things. And nor render them, which is immutare, in any other language unless in Latin. So basically it's requesting a phonetic loan word from Latin, or at least in the Indian language, inasmuch the Indian terms of the region clearly and precisely correspond to the Latin meaning. So basically what Tournon was doing, he was banning the use of translation equivalence, so translata, so that's my interpretation of this, as a translation equivalence, dynamic translations, no, in that sense. Cherished by the Jesuit missionaries on the assumption by Tournon that these were loose and metaphoric. And so he imposed the use of Latin phonetic loanwords, or at least the Indian translation of Latin concepts that could be made in a clear and accurate way. So the title of this presentation, Liquido, in Latin, it's like clear and smoothly flowing like water. So in that sense. And adamussim is basically according to a plumb line or a carpenter's rule, namely in an accurate, precise way. So that's transparency and precision, we could say. These are the criteria that he is setting. And then the third clause, which has to do with the translation, language, and so on, is about pagan books. So he was concerned, Tournon, with the reading of obscene or superstitious books, Hindu books with obscene or superstitious matters. And in this clause, however, I would say, he is, of course, very much known as anti-Jesuitical and so on, but actually maybe it's a rhetorical pose only, but still, he does greatly commend the zeal and diligence of the missionaries, meaning the Jesuits, who have translated into Malabar or Tamil language books containing the sacred doctrine of the Holy Catholic Church and the records, monumenta, of sacred things, or who are composing even new works, ex novo, for the benefit and instruction of the Indian Christians. And then he's basically banning the fabulous books, so the traditional Hindu literature, but is also allowing for dispensations, for reading them. Just as, of course, we know the system of censorship in early modern Catholic world, in Europe, in early modern Catholic Europe or Americas, had a whole mechanism of dispensations granted and so on for reading some of the forbidden books. So even here, it was provided that the parish priest or the missionary with the care of souls could dispensate and select some of these, so to say, native books for reading. Yes, fundamentally, this is the point. I should say that this clause does not strike us for an anti-Jesuitic attitude or for a bigot censorial rigor against the native literary traditions, because it does have some qualifications. Theoretically, Tournon could have forbidden straight away all access to pagan books on the basis of a precautionary, tutsioristic approach. As he obviously was totally illiterate in any Asian languages, he could have actually been safer from his point of view to ban all books straight away. However, just also to see, let's say, the other side of the censor, of the judge, in this case, Tournon, he also was a man of letter, or at least of literary sociability. He was a founding member of the Accademia dell'Arcadia, whose archive, by the way, has been for quite some time in Biblioteca Angelica that we visited on the first day of this conference. And he basically adopted a different approach in relation to pagan books. So he said that in general, books dealing with the false religion and containing sexual obscenities and superstitions should not be read, but he exactly provided for a system of dispensations and authorizations to single Christians. So, of course, this is all an ad hoc, ad personam authorizations. It's not general. And in relation to this, we have to see a general rule, rule number 7 of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum. So, basically, the official list of forbidden books for all Catholics, which said, as a general rule, in addition to the list of every single book that was banned, this general rule stated that lascivious or obscene matters were forbidden, books with such content were forbidden. However, there was obviously the problem of classical literature, Latin and Greek. What to do with works that were elegant, that were important for, learning rhetorics and style. So ancient works written by pagans were permitted on account of elegance and propriety of their language, but still there was this caution, which is about, in this case, age. Children still should not have access to those. Just think of Ovid, let's say. So, as I said, exactly, the clause 17 was an adaptation of the general rule number 7 of the Index of the Forbidden Books. It should be noticed that books dealing specifically with the ancient pagan religions in Europe, so according to the general rule, they were not banned at all in Europe, as long as they did not have an obscene character, so simply a work of Roman or Greek mythology, as long as it was not, so to say, propounding sexual obscenity and debauchery, it was not forbidden. But what is obviously the difference is that there was no pagan religion practiced in Europe anymore. That was the problem, the difference in relation to India. Because Indian books concerning Hinduism in India could be threatening just as books of Lutheran or Calvinist doctrine. And of course, these heretics had started their own missions in the region. So, just comparing censorship in India and in Europe. In Europe, the censorship of books truly dangerous, such as those promoting heresy, was centralized by Roman institutions like the Roman Inquisition, the Congregation of Index, or even the Master of the Sacred Palace. Whereas in the three South Indian accommodationist missions, an analogous function of censorship and permission of reading was delegated by Tournon to parish priests or missionaries with care of souls. And also I should say that I would like to stress that clause 17 contained an explicit praise of the efforts made by the missionaries, namely the Jesuits, to create a Christian literature in Tamil language. The decree that all the Malabar rites, the norms underwent the so-called controversy, namely it was a process of appealing against the decree, confirming the decree, and eventually enforcing it with some modifications. Just focusing on the three relevant clauses, innovations were brought in by Pope Clement XII in 1734. So in relation to the problem of the baptismal name, we see that there is a change from an obligation of imposing names from the martyrology. We have an invitation to make all efforts. So no more praecipimus, whereas current quantum fieri potest. So it's a changing the, so to say, the nature of the obligation. And also there was a mention that Tamil names that were not specifically pagan, namely that were indifferent, could be tolerated. So there we see that there is somehow a softening of the prescription. Concerning the translata, the sacred objects names, we see that the ban on the use of this translata was somehow loosened in the sense that this ban did not apply anymore to those terms that had been commonly received since the establishment of the mission, so since the time of Nobili or soon after maybe. But clause 17 concerning the forbidden books, etc., remained as it was, I think because fundamentally it was sufficiently loose and elastic for interpretation, so probably even on the side of the Jesuits, there wasn't so much push on that to get that revoked at that point. Now, trying to understand the kind of discourses that were developed around these issues. Let's see a point of view of an unnamed cardinal in the Holy Office. So this is from documents in the archive of the Roman Inquisition. So a cardinal who was supporting these three clauses, etc. So he was saying that in an Aristotelic way, in personal names, in baptismal names, we can distinguish substance, namely the intrinsic meaning, and accidents, the phonetical and grammatical specificities of a name. So he was giving the example, Guglielmo in Italian, Guglielmus in Latin, Guillaume in French, William in English. So we would say the root is the same, it has the substance, the meaning, and then the endings, the phonetic adjustments, and so on, they are the accidents. So according to this Aristotelian scheme, according to him, proper names should be transported in the language of Madurai, in Tamil, with the only variation of accent, endings, and so forth. So fundamentally, he was advocating a phonetic loan word with obviously Tamil dissonances, endings, and so on. All languages borrowed words, he was making a general statement, all languages borrowed words from other languages, so that for the inhabitants of Madurai, it is certain that they do not have expressions to explain all the objects of the Christian faith, because Christianity was unknown before. Hence, it was necessary they should adopt new expressions, or if they wanted to take advantage of the combination of their old terms, they were bound to phrase them in such a way that they corresponded exactly to the meaning of the Latin terms consecrated by the Apostolic See. Whereas, and the cardinal was complaining, the Jesuits in Madurai Mission had followed a totally different and erroneous approach by adopting creative translations. However, now it was too late to get rid of those words because they had become customary, and hence the direct incorporation of Latin loan words should be compulsory only for future instances. What had been done until that, it was accepted that should remain. So, and this was a position in support of the decree. And the same cardinal, talking on the name of sacred things, said that this was an entirely different issue, because these names, they were not like the baptismal, the personal names, they were voci appellative, which we can discuss how to translate that in English or even interpret in Italian, what exactly it means. I think it's something like denominative terms. They can have equivalents, semantic equivalents in other languages. So in this case, it was not necessary to proceed ad litteram as long as no use was made of traslati. So in my interpretation of this, he's basically saying that we have traslati, which are loose metaphorical translations. Then we have semantic translations, which are faithful. And then we have exactly phonetic loan words, right? So The apostles, according to him, had set, and the evangelists had set the example. So, for instance, the word denoting sacrifice in Hebrew was tsevach, and in Greek became thusia. And then, speaking of the word mysterion in Greek New Testament, becoming a sacramentum in the Latin Vulgate. So the missionaries should use faithful Indian translations in the future, and also teach the precise meaning of the traslati that had become customary, so that those people may have the very same ideas in mind that the words used by the Latin Church communicated. So it was basically saying the missionaries should be careful in enforcing, so to say, a hermeneutical discipline. So everyone should know what that word means and should not mean. Now, a position in favor of the Jesuits, or maybe critical of the decree, is the one of Marcantonio Ansidei, assessor of the Holy Office, in relation to these clauses. He believed that Tournon had imposed a dubious and unheard of obligation by restricting the choice of baptismal names only to the names of saints in the Roman martyrology. So why this was so narrow and dubious? In the first place, the very Roman martyrology contained the names of early martyrs called Apollo, Hymeneo, Mercurio, so names of pagan gods. So why martyrs, Christian martyrs, had pagan names of pagan gods, and this was a problem then in India. And not only that, leaving aside early Christianity, let's talk about Renaissance Europe, or in this case, actually, early 18th century Europe. There were Christians with names like Diana, Penelope, Ercole, like, I don't know, I was just mentioning here, Ercole Gonzaga, Papal Legate at the Council of Trent. It's a cardinal, and he has this name. And I was very happy to find further evidence from the presentation of Elena. Democrito, Bernardo Bitti, she told me actually, that he was registered in the catalog as Democrito, but then eventually it was literally struck Democrito. And we can imagine, having, so to say, Democrito, such a philosopher, problematic philosopher from a Christian point of view, atomism and so on, as a Christian baptismal name given at baptism, of course it's a problem. And so this was allowed and tolerated in Europe, even though sometimes the embarrassment was there, like striking Democrito, but then why imposing such strict regulation in India? Broglia Antonio Brandolini, procurator of the Jesuit missions in Rome, he defended in the 1720s and early 1730s the traslati. He said, I should say that he is a fantastic person, because clearly in many cases he simply made up arguments. There was one about saying that certain combinations of consonants were alien to Tamil, st, ps, sm, but then of course there was immediately the answer, and yes, what about Christ? And yes, of course, Tamil has a Christ, a Tamil rendering of it, so you see that, this was something we were just talking with Angelo Cattaneo just before. Let's take missionary sources with a lot of caution. Terms are, he also claimed with I would say a conventionalist approach, that terms are significations ad placitum, so according to conventions. So that once these terms were assumed and accepted by all the community of those faithful so as to signify the same as our Latin words, then, in that case, one should not doubt that those Tamil words do not express and do not lead the Tamils to conceive that same notion of the sacred mysteries that is produced in us by our terms. So, he was basically saying that the words can have a meaning that we give to them. And at that point, we should not question if there has been this kind of convention, placitum. No objections furthermore should be raised for those translations that had already been done liquido et adamussim, traditionally in the mission. And he was giving some examples. So cross, silovai, comparing with crux, stauros, sliba in Syriac. God, and he was giving a list of names that already Giulia Nardini mentioned, so I'm not going to repeat, but you can see them. Swami, Andavar, Devan, Sarvesaram, Vastu, Tambiran. Trinity, tirut tuvam, you can clearly see that it's exactly a combination of tree and then tuvam, like tas in Latin, no? And he also argued that Jesus Christ, Mary had been mutated directly from Latin. So he was defending the practice and saying it's not exactly as Tournon understood, that we were making up names. But when we get to the names of the apostles, yes, we do find some cases which are a bit perplexing. There is the case of Peter. So Peter becoming Rajan, king, but understood by Brandolini as a cornerstone of the empire. Actually, it means just a king. But anyhow, the literal translation of Kepha, rock, he argued, and yes, this is totally understandable and right, I would say. Kallu in Tamil, which is colloquial Tamil, and also a Telugu variant of Kal, which is the literary Tamil, it sounded comical in Tamil. So in Latin, it was a Pietra in Italian. I would say, if I'm allowed to say something maybe not so serious, it would be like saying that this name, like Kallu, would have been like Sercio in Roman dialect. I mean, if our apostle is not Pietra, but is Sercio, it's maybe not exactly very serious. So, just to give an idea. Paul, on the contrary, argued, and it's absolutely true, was a very literal translation, Chinna meaning small, and so Chinnan. John Arulan, from Arul, grace, was rendering Yohanan, God has been gracious in Hebrew. There are names like Andrew, which I've been investigating, asking with experts of Tamil Christian, etc. We are not sure, like Bilendran, why they translated Bilendran, it's not very clear. According to him, it meant force. Stephen Muriappan must be related with Moody, which means a crown. Very mysterious also the case of Joseph Deverton. Mysterious because he says that it meant filius accrescens, referring to the etymology in Genesis, and she called his name Joseph and said, the Lord shall add to me another son, filius accrescens. But in fact, already at the time of Brandolini, the name which had become canonical, and it is today, is Susai, which is, in fact, a phonetic loan word from Portuguese. Susai is José. So, but very, very embarrassing and problematic, how to translate sacrament. Brandolini said that we had at least 3 different choices. I'm using here Tamil in linguistic renderings instead of what he is basically saying. Iragasiam, but he uses rugacham, secret mystery. Then a very strange compound, Archiasishta Lakshanam, sorry, there is a mistake there, Lakshanam, it's not Lakshakam, most sacred sign, and here I'm referring to an information received from Margherita Trent, who is basically the major specialist on Tamil Christianity and Tamil Christian literature. She says that Archiasishta is a strange compound of Archi, which means sacred, and then basically compounded with a Sanskrit superlative ending. It is used already, still, in the second half of the 18th century by Giacomo Tommaso de Rossi, Jesuit, to indicate saints. But Brandolini says, in fact, now, which means 1720s approximately, we are using diraviam, which he says means treasure, but if we check in the Tamil lexicon, it means substance, entity, and it is actually a word that has been used in Jain terminology. But then I said actually at the beginning, no, I didn't say, I apologize, when I was mentioning the different classification of the rituals, the reproducing society or distinguishing society, the social classes, I didn't mention the most important thing possibly, namely that all those rituals, in my opinion, they are samskara, namely passage rituals, some of which are obvious, like marriage, birth, and so on. And an obvious translation of sacrament could have been this, but precisely it was not this because that was the most Hindu, so to say, embodied concept you could think of. Just as, for instance, and I'm referring to a recent publication that I made, they didn't use Trimurti for Trinity, even though someone also suggested that this could be used, but fundamentally no. So, because, yes, there was a very strong similarity, but fundamentally it was hinting, I would say, very clearly to paganism. So, and still, baptism is very much like namakarana, which is a fundamental samskara, naming, giving a name to the newborn. And also, of course, Giulia Nardini mentioned already, vivaha, marriage. So, broadly speaking, both Catholic sacraments and Hindu samskara were rites of passage marking the various phases in one's life. Experts like the Jesuit missionaries could not ignore such affinities, hence the avoidance of samskara as a translation for sacramentum could only be deliberate and intentional. While the Jesuits and Tournon could disagree on the specific assessment to be given to a certain ritual, they all feared that Christian sacred objects and figures could be translated by borrowing categories of the local pagan religion, namely Hinduism. The close resemblance of Hindu rituals with Catholic ones, pilgrimages, penances, celibacy, holy water, etc., was unsettling by suggesting that the true faith and paganism were just too similar. While this could be understood as a satanic inversion and mockery, it could also have skeptic outcomes connecting Tridentine Catholicism to more or less radical forms of the Enlightenment. I mean, if actually Catholicism, even to the eyes of a Catholic, looks so similar to paganism, are you sure still that your faith is the true faith? And I conclude just with some bibliographical indications in case you are interested in knowing more. There are works of ethnography, like the one by Brigitte Sébastien, Le Ronde de Saint-Antoine, and also the one by The Saint in the Banyan Tree, by David Moss, which have been studying basically Tamil Christian, Tamil popular Christianity, Tamil popular Catholicism, on the one hand, and on the other hand, what I consider a masterpiece, which is Writing Tamil Catholicism, Literature, Persuasion and Devotion in the 18th Century by Margherita Trento, 2022, which basically has been the first work ever connecting the study of Tamil literature and basically a hardcore missionary history based on archival sources and so on. So I would really recommend you to also try to explore these works in a field which is exactly early modern Indian Catholicism, which I think can certainly lead to interesting reflections, so possibly relevant also in the American context. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Antonio Paolo Aragno. I never studied this right controversy, only the Chinese, and it was really an interesting reflection about this vocabulary. Thank you very much. Now, the second speaker is Shruti Rai Gopal of the University College of Cork. In her doctoral research, she examined the Neo-Latin ethnographic descriptions of India in the early modern time, focusing the establishment of Latin schools in India, the significance of Latin culture and language in India, and how India was perceived in European humanist circle is naturally of great interest. Her title, Latin in a Multilingual Society, India's Contribution to Renaissance Humanism in the 16th Century. Please, I give you, you have the word.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that warm introduction, and thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity to be able to present among this lovely group of papers and speakers. I've also been able to tune into and stream online on YouTube, so it's just a pleasure listening to some of the papers that have been given over the course of the last 3 days. So, like it has been introduced, I've been working on Latin descriptions of India, and what I'm presenting today is formed a smaller part of my doctoral dissertation, where I looked at Latin schools, establishment of Latin schools in India between the period 1548 to 1597. So roughly 40 to 50 years is what I'm covering through this paper. So I'm just going to share my screen. And so in 1585, Sebastian Vaz, a local convert of Goan origins, in his letter to Claudio Aquaviva, requested to be relieved of his missionary duties, explaining the reason as follows. Porque como digo aviso principale, além de naturalmente ser muito fraco e enfermo, as partes naturais serem poucas, porque nem ainda latim sei bem, porque nunca me darão lugar para isso. Todas estas causas me são motivo de morte desencantação. Vaz was never officially admitted as a member to the Society of Jesus, although he was associated with it for nearly 20 long years. Although this extract informs us of his sickness, more importantly, it reveals details of his lack of knowledge of Latin. Despite the long years spent in association with the Jesuits, we learn that he did not know Latin well. This is a rare example where we are informed of a local responding and determining his own linguistic ability in Latin in India in the 16th century. Hence, through this paper, I will examine how Latin was taught in India between 1548 to 1597, because it's between 1586 to 1599, you see the development and there's the use of the Ratio Studiorum. So it's the second half of the 16th century that plays a really significant role in understanding how Latin was introduced in India. For this, I've used the 18 volumes of the Documenta Indica series and will focus on the Jesuit methods of teaching, since they emphasize the importance of Latin education among locals and its use in India. This is in response to the significant role Latin had gained in Europe during this period. Europeans, through their revived interest and knowledge of classical Latin, developed the Republic of Letters. One of the key areas that I've been examining is to find how India and Indians fit into this republic, especially through their knowledge of Latin. And as you can see on the slide, I developed this illustration in order to see as to how through India's connection with Portugal and the missionary establishment of schools, how did India get connected to classical Latin texts? Missionaries such as the Jesuits introduced Latin in the country using a curriculum similar to the Studia Humanitatis. Consequently, Latin's use and its role in India was to promote Christianity and acted as an agent for conversion. Its true usage was for native converts to understand and engage with Christian doctrine, while the means to acquire the requisite linguistic knowledge, namely study of a humanistic curriculum, also served to introduce Indians to civilized European history and culture. But before we gather how locals were civilized through their knowledge of Latin, it is important to understand how Latin was introduced and used in India in the later half of the 16th century. Prior to the Jesuits, the Franciscans had successfully established churches and seminaries where Christians, both of Portuguese and Indian origins, could congregate. As a result, we are frequently informed of how locals gained proficiency in Portuguese in the early 1500s before we get a formalized or a standard understanding of the establishment of Latin education in India. In this regard, I followed scholarship by Angelo Barreto Xavier and Inês Zupanov, who've explained early methods of how Portuguese was taught to locals by using cartilhas and the Christian doctrine. Zupanov explains that cartilhas belong to a pedagogical literary genre that combined the learning of reading and writing with basic prayers and religious teachings. It is through such early records that we are informed of language training and exchange in Portuguese among locals of India, essentially through materials focusing on Christian virtues. It is only after St. Francis Xavier in 1542 that we begin to see the establishment of a much stronger administrative network of missionary approaches, and particularly their schooling system or their education system is what I'm focusing on through these administrative letters. The members of the Society of Jesus were known to promote the importance of education and establish schools and universities in Europe, and they approached their mission fields with the same goals. From early on, Jesuits acknowledged the humanist method of education. This training included classical Latin grammar, poetry, rhetoric, and moral philosophy. These schools included boys of Portuguese, Indian, and mixed origins, in addition to boys attending from various other parts of Asia, such as Japan and China, and Malacca. As a result, the first school in Goa was established between 1548 to 1549, and it's St. Paul's in Goa, the same years when the Jesuit school in Messina in Italy was open to the local crowd. Also, within the first 40 years, the Jesuits founded nearly 20 schools in India where a curriculum similar to the Studia was used. And like you see on the slide, I've tried to plot these schools along the eastern and the western coasts of India as the Jesuits started to progress and expand their administrative network and establish these schools. Although I should mention that Latin was not introduced at the same time in all of these schools, and there's a very specific reason for that, which I'll get to in the next few minutes. As part of this curriculum, the Jesuits had planned sessions according to the different levels that students achieved through their attendance. Like you see on the slide, it illustrates the information provided for the years 1556 to 1557, where we see that the Jesuits used both classical and Christian Latin resources to train boys attending their schools. Even though the Jesuits frequently talk about expanding and establishing schools in different parts of India, they simultaneously mention the lack of teachers who could capably conduct lessons in Latin. So between 1548 to 1563, there were only 2 schools that were teaching Latin. And like you see, the first school was in Goa, St. Paul's in 1548, and the other school was in Bessin, which was in 1563. Alessandro Valignano, the visitor of the society, urges the use of Latin, especially in Goa, and permits the use of Portuguese elsewhere in 1584. Valignano was also responsible for encouraging the establishment of seminaries that promoted Christianity through the Indian vernacular languages that he repeatedly iterated in 1569 and in 1576. Here, it is worth taking a moment to understand the purpose for which locals were admitted in such schools, the need to train them in classical Latin, and its role in the spread of Christianity. In the year 1545, Niccolo Lancilotto, an Italian Jesuit residing in India, outlines that wards did not know Latin. Although his opinion changes within a year, and in 1546, we find him say that they began to understand Latin sermons. I must note that Lancilotto is also one of the few members who lays emphasis on the ignorance found among locals. And by ignorance, he means both lack of knowledge of Latin and that of the Christian doctrine. Furthermore, in the year 1545, he explains how locals must be trained in the faith in Latin so that they could continue to preach to a larger crowd in their own native tongue. From early on, we begin to get glimpses of the role of an interpreter that locals will play in the future through their knowledge of Latin. This opinion was also shared by Valignano, who in 1575 points out the following. He says, L'altro rimedio è il procurare di criar molti di questi fanciulli della terra che aperino bene la lingua portuguesa et se introscoino a servir per interpreti et ancora quelli che saranno capaci farli studiare per sacerdote perché ancor che li nostri aperino la lingua tuttavia pochi saranno quelli che l'apprendino in modo che possino sicuramente predicare et perciò sempre saranno necessari gli interpreti. He gives an account of one of the roles prescribed to local wards was to work as an interpreter. This extract also reveals the continuous interplay between the languages taught, that is Portuguese and Latin. And although I don't have a slide over here, we find how missionaries harnessed local knowledge or local awareness of Portuguese. Because in 1562, you find another letter written by Gomes Vaz, another Jesuit, who's suggesting about how locals knew the language. And in that case, he is referring to Portuguese because he's talking about the neighborhood of Bessin, where Latin was introduced only in 1563. So missionaries harnessed local awareness in Portuguese to train them in classical Latin. This information enables us to examine Vaz's declaration reviewed earlier, where he reflects on his knowledge of Latin. This can be proven further through another example of a local convert, Pedro Lewis. Lewis was a Brahmin convert and the only Indian to have been admitted to the Society of Jesus prior to its suppression in 1773. While Lewis's career has been examined extensively by historians such as Dinesh Zupano, who mentions his linguistic and rhetorical skills, there is a lack of scholarship that explains or gives an account of his use of Latin education. Like Vaz, even Lewis's journey was complicated and he encountered circumstantial delays in his ecclesiastical training. Despite these delays, we find letters by him in Portuguese more than in Latin. But there are 2 instances that I'd like to draw your attention to, and I have them on the slide, where he introduces phrases or details in Latin. And one of it is from the Book of Judith, and this was written in the earlier years, where he is still encouraging or persuading members as to how he can help out in the mission field. Whereas the second letter was written in 1572, where he's trying to persuade members and encourage the admittance of locals or Indians as members to the Society of Jesus. These extracts reiterate Lancilotto's earlier comment of locals understanding Latin sermons and their role as an interpreter. Having explored the extant letters by Lewis, we are continually informed of his achievements in the process of proselytization, hearing confessions, and inculcating Christian virtue through his knowledge of Portuguese, Latin sermons, and of local languages such as Tamil. Although we see these skills in Portuguese and that of code switching between languages, we are not informed of his linguistic ability in Latin, at least not directly through written records from these letters. His knowledge of Latin was a requirement as part of his vocational training, and from the catalogue of 1594, we are informed that the number of years he was trained in Grammatica or Latin was 1. So from Lewis's case, we can see how he used his training in Latin and his fluency in Portuguese. Lewis and Voss's journeys emphasized that Latin was introduced, but also made me examine the extent to which the language was used by the members themselves during their residence in India. While Voss comments on his linguistic ability, the Council of Goa, held in 1567, also comments on the Latin practiced by the members in India as barbero e rudo, which clearly indicates that the Jesuits did not actively practice or use Latin in India, unlike the case in Europe. This comment by the Council can be interpreted as a response to the medieval use of Latin, not complying with the style that humanists practiced. More importantly, it lays emphasis on the lack of use of Latin by members who resided in India. Furthermore, letters from early years mention the curriculum, some of the authors, and their works that they used. But Voss's comment made me look more extensively into how Latin was taught to locals. In a letter written by Francesco Durão in 1589 from Tuticorin, which is along the southeast coast of India, he explains that o seminário que neste Tuticori se fez em que estarão perto de 30 moços, os 22 aprendem latim na sua língua malabar, os outros andam na escola de ler e escrever. Following Voss's comment, this is another rare example where we find details of how locals learned Latin using Malabar, that is in this case, Tamil. So we begin to gather the reasons why Latin may not have flourished in the same way in India as it did in Europe. While this was the case in Tuticorin, the situation among the St. Thomas Christians was slightly different. Initially, letters explain how locals progressed with their studies in Latin among this group, followed by some records of their reaction and responses. In 1593, Father Toscano explains how knowledge of Latin allowed wards to travel to other dioceses, especially to places where the Portuguese resided. This statement reveals how knowledge of Latin brought locals in close contact with the settler colonies in India and illustrates their use of Latin and possibly Portuguese. However, this was contradictory to the whole reason for inculcating values of the language and Christianity among locals, as the missionaries hoped locals would preach to a larger crowd in their own vernacular languages. Yet again a reminder of what Lancelotto suggested in 1545. In this regard, languages that are frequently mentioned, especially in the context of St. Thomas Christians, are Syriac and occasionally Chaldean. In 1577, Valignano recommended replacing Chaldean books with Latin in order to erase local memory of the former. Although this technique sounds very similar to what historians such as Daniel Wasserman Soler and Walter Mignolo note as colonizing memories in the context of the New World, the situation in this part of India was far more complex due to their previous understanding of the faith, which may have given them a leverage over learning in Latin. Despite Valignano's recommendations, there were a few members like Francis Ross who were involved in teaching the doctrine through Syriac instead of Latin. Here, Ross mentions how locals who learned Syriac found Latin to be rather strange. Towards the end of this passage, you see, he says, y se espera mucho mayor fruto que con la lengua latina, que les es muy extraña. Clearly, this is one of the few examples where we have of local preference and reaction to Latin's insertion in their curriculum. The use of the term strange or strania is also revealing of their attitudes to consider and acknowledge Latin's foreign nature when compared to Syriac. Whether this was the case for any other local language cannot be testified on the basis of this example. Additionally, we cannot validate this explanation for the entire country, as this could have been a preference due to their previous awareness of this religion through Syriac or Chaldean. Their inclination of using Syriac resembles the earlier example of how Latin was taught through Malabar. This is in stark contrast to their earlier belief, as is seen in the extract and editorial notes provided, which suggests their knowledge of Latin allowed them to work among Portuguese and not local crowds. However, here the use of strania aids in measuring local preferences, perceptions, and reception to cultural encounters. The two examples from Tuticorin and St. Thomas Christians help in evaluating how locals began to engage with this prestige language. Contrary to the scene in Europe, Latin's limited role in India seems to have confined local usage for a single purpose, without permitting their participation in the Republic or its international usage. While the letters lay emphasis on the importance of training boys in Latin to be able to preach the virtues of Christianity in their native language, there is no information regarding developing this knowledge further at universities in the country. In this regard, the Superior General Eduardo Mercuriano in 1578 granted the license to the rectors of the College of St. Paul's in Goa to confer bachelor degrees to students who studied under our obedience. This license offered the papal privilege of conferring bachelor's and doctorate degrees to boys. Hence, the license facilitated growth, but only on the basis of as and when the need arose to confer locals by this method. This may be due to the subjects one had to study in order to earn this degree, one of which was philosophy. There are at least 3 references in these letters that explain insecurity among locals when they compared themselves to those who studied from Portugal and Rome and traveled to India. This further incited a notion of hatred towards studying philosophy, which can be proven by the efforts taken by Matteo Ricci in 1581. Hence, even though these letters clearly outlined the levels of Latin education offered, there was no university setup that facilitated this curriculum in India. Indeed, in the 17th century, the Franciscans established St. Bonaventura in Goa, which compensated for the lack of a university setting in India. However, this worked similarly to the Jesuit system of papal privileges. Despite these complexities that the locals encountered in India, I'd like to conclude by drawing your attention to the few individuals who contributed to the Republic of Letters. We find both Indians and Portuguese Indians who not only gained their training in Latin in Goa, but were also renowned for their contributions in Europe. This list includes Goan converts such as Mateus de Castro, Francesco Rego, Antonio Frias, Diana do Paes, and a few Portuguese Indians such as Miguel Purificação and Andreas Baianos. Baianos was one of the few individuals whose literary accomplishments illustrate his contribution to the field of Neo-Latin literature, which includes his renowned translation of the Lusiads in 1625. Latin may have been introduced for religious purposes in the country, and as rare as Vaza's comment, rarer are the examples of their written contributions to the language. These examples make their case unique and illustrate their individual journeys to being included in the Republic of Letters and therefore India's contribution to humanism in Europe. Thank you.
E direi che chiudiamo in italiano, sì, nella lingua di Bertonio. Allora, ho chiesto di proiettare questa immagine che, come molti di voi riconosceranno, è chiaramente ispirata in una delle immagini presenti nell'Imago Primi Secoli. E un po' perché ci sembra che il nostro call for paper, diciamo, l'idea che avevamo proposto nel call for paper, cioè di raccogliere le differenti forme della parola di Dio attraverso i processi di evangelizzazione e missioni gesuitiche, hanno illustrato una grande varietà di metodologie, però tutte collegate attraverso un filo unico che in questo caso va al di là dei territori, ma che li unisce tutti. Credo che abbiamo avuto delle presentazioni splendide, eccezionali, che ci hanno fatto riflettere molto e su come comunque, è sempre una cosa da dire, non finisce mai. Un solo mondo non basta, una sola vita non basta anche per studiare la compagnia di Gesù, il suo ruolo e la sua grande varietà di uomini, di strategie, di risultati, di successi, di fracassi anche, successi e insuccessi. E quindi vorrei un brevissimo commento anche dai miei 2 compagni, visto che purtroppo il professore Merluzzi si è ammalato, e quindi niente, vi lascio la parola.
Allora, da parte mia era molto interessante osservare tutte queste riflessioni che si svolgono nei dintorni, si può dire, di questa tematica di missione e lingua. Per me soprattutto interessante dalla prospettiva di un gesuita anche come c'è una grande ricchezza che è caratterizza anche la cultura moderna in un senso più ampio e non soltanto la storia della Compagnia di Gesù. È sicuramente anche affascinante come abbiamo tramite queste lingue una forte attività creativa cristiana fuori Europa. Allora abbiamo un forte segno come il tempo moderno rompeva qui le dimensioni antiche di un'Europa antica e cristiana. Quindi questo è un grande arricchimento, penso, per la storia moderna, ma anche per l'identità e la storia della Compagnia di Gesù. Tante grazie.
Ma aggiungo solo... Sì? No? Così. Aggiungo solo 2 parole, ringraziando anche tutti voi per la presenza, perché poi credo che avere in sala persone che comunque studiano argomenti e temi simili con prospettive diverse sia sempre molto stimolante per il dibattito. All'interno del dibattito sono emerse anche continuità magari con altri ordini religiosi, e sto pensando appunto ai temi della professoressa Turchetta, ma non solo. Quindi speriamo che si possano aprire nuove prospettive, eventualmente anche nuovi momenti di incontro comparativi, perché no? E che i progetti che sono stati presentati oggi poi possano svilupparsi nel miglior modo possibile. Quindi grazie a tutti e speriamo presto,
chissà, magari un altro anno di ritrovarci di nuovo
Di continuare le ricerche.
continuare le ricerche.
Sì.
Esatto. Grazie a tutti.
Grazie.